This is the Tory Leadership Election podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home. Welcome to another edition of Conservative Home's Tory Leadership Election podcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, with Mark Wallace, executive editor of Conservative Home. So, Mark, we've had the first ballot, we've got the result, and we'll start by asking, as we have for the previous two podcasts, who's had a good week?
Well, you're chuckling already for a very good reason, because it's a truism to say obviously Boris Johnson's had a good week. Not only did he, of course, declaring our interests secure Conservative Home support in the contest, but he won that ballot. But actually, I think he's had a good week in other potentially more important ways than just that number in the ballot. And that is the performance, the actual running of his campaign's machine, I think has been really quite impressive. There was a notable piece in The Guardian at the start of the week, which was investigating the organisation of the kind of Team Johnson and the way it was surprising some of his colleagues. And to a certain extent, if he crashed and burned in 2016, in part because his colleagues lost faith in him, in his lack of organisation, he seems to be learning from that and is going all out to assure people not just that he's a winner, but that he actually has the right machine around him to get this done properly and he can be trusted. And that actually, I think, has a much deeper importance than just saying a bunch of MPs like me.
Yes, he's got a team with a soft cop, which is James Wharton, former MP up in Teesside, who's brought a lot of structure and discipline in dealing with the Commons. And then he's got a not-so-soft cop in the form of Gavin Williamson. I've not looked at this, we haven't looked at it, but there were claims that Tory MPs had been asked to photograph their ballot papers to show they were voting for Boris Johnson. And the 22 committee had therefore said no mobile phones in the room. And Boris has also got, as well as soft cop and not-so-soft cop, he's got Grant Shapps sort of compiling the numbers and stats. So his organisation this time so far has been watertight. He's certainly got Conservative Home's endorsement as the best potential election winner on Monday. I think another winner this week, in my view, has been someone who said that Conservative Home's survey was responsible for his success, namely Rory Stewart. Now, Rory Stewart is right at the back of the pack on only about 19 votes, but he's doubled what it was thought he could get, and the momentum of his sort of extraordinary campaign is carrying him up a bit. I think he's probably reached a limit. I think his tactical judgment is better than his strategic judgment, but he's had a week in which, in one way, he's been rather like the Boris Johnson that used to be in grabbing attention and headlines. And his chutzpah is extraordinary. He went on the TV with only 19 votes and said, "My colleagues have read the Conservative Home survey this morning, which put me second, and they've recognised only I can beat Boris Johnson." He didn't give the actual figures, which were that he's 40 points behind Boris Johnson.
Indeed, and I think there are two things that are happening there. The first is, of course, that to more than just scrape past that margin of the number of MPs needed to survive, what was a win for Rory Stewart. Remember, his team were reportedly hunting the corridors of Westminster to find where Ken Clarke had gone, somebody who doesn't carry a mobile phone and had gone missing, managed to vote, I think, with Rory Stewart on his arm, basically, at about 20 minutes before the deadline. So that shows they expected it to be a closer run thing than it ended up being for him. I think I said in the first episode of this podcast that he was not just running an energetic campaign, but in some ways he wasn't really running to be leader of the Conservative Party, but leader of a wing or a tradition of the Conservative Party, one that hasn't really had a leader since Ken Clarke was in his pomp. He's definitely achieved that, but the big challenge for him is his campaign snowballing support? Is he actually gathering a position as an alternative, kind of stop Boris candidate, in which case this is the start of further growth? Or is it, as seems more likely to me, is this towards his ceiling of support? Actually, has he managed to is he maxing out the potential vote of that particular wing? It's notable Conservative Home Survey finds that he's on about 11% support in the leadership race. It also finds that 11% or thereabouts is the level of support among Tory members for a second referendum. And while he's not explicitly a Remainer candidate, he's probably near as damn it, or the nearest closest thing to that you might find were you a Conservative who was very deeply uncomfortable about Brexit. So if he's cornered that market, if that was his objective, then he's done extremely well.
Of course, in one sense, he's a leaver. His official policy is to support the Theresa May withdrawal agreement, which has already failed 3 times. I mean, we eventually gave it the nod on Come Home, and in that sense, his position is a pro-leave position. However, the real test now, with politics becoming more divisive, with the Lib Dem progress in the European elections and the much bigger Brexit Party success, is are you or are you not in favour of no deal? And Rory Stewart, of course, is anti-no deal, and that must establish some sort of ceiling for him in this leadership election.
Indeed. And on the flip side of this question, as ever, who do you think's had a bad week?
Everyone else. To one measure or another, everyone else has had a bad week. And I'll try to prove it with a bit of rough arithmetic. I mean, like Guido Fawkes's figures for who is supporting who, ours are inevitably incomplete. But like Guido's again, they're not a bad place to start from. So on the morning of the first ballot, we had about 74 unallocated Conservative MPs. Right. 30 of them will have gone for Boris Johnson, assuming that people supported who they said they'd support. That's not bad. I mean, Boris took basically something approaching like half that unallocated total, about 30 votes. Jeremy Hunt on that margin took 7, right? Michael Gove took under 5. Raab and Sanjay Javid took almost nothing at all, kind of single figures. So everyone else has failed to break through. Hunt's failed to break through as a major challenger on the numbers. Michael Gove has refused to lie down and die, as it were. His support didn't collapse, but it's not really made any progress either. He's just sort of hanging in there. Boris Johnson has squeezed the Eurosceptic Brexiteer vote to the point there's not very much left for Dom Raab. And Sajid Javid, really, who began to show signs of more energy, quite attractive campaign video, lots of stuff about his backstory. He didn't make any progress either, and he's 5th. And of course, Matt Hancock's pulled out today. That's yesterday, as the listeners are hearing it. And one of the reasons I think is it's not just because he realised he'd reached a ceiling. What happened if there was another ballot and Rory Stewart overtook him, even by a few votes? That's regress. So Hancock's been quite, I think, astute in pulling out now.
Yes, it's almost like one of those games of no deal or no deal on the TV, isn't it? Not the Brexit theme, where you need to realise exactly where you're meeting your peak value from the banker. And actually, Matt Hancock, I think, probably quite astutely realised there was a risk that the offers he was going to get were going to start declining. I think you're right. I think Jeremy Hunt, in particular, of the surviving candidates, I think has had a bit of a shocker actually in that ballot. He's not pulled away from, and in fact is in pretty close contention with cocaine scandal-struck Michael Gove, which is not where he would want to be. And it says some slightly worrying things for him, I think, for his campaign, about where he was before that scandal arrived. And actually, imagine the scandal had never happened in last week's press on the back of Owen Bennett's book. Michael Gove had actually been able to spend the weekend talking about positive things that he might want to talk about. Or even if it had just been, the race had been frozen where it was last Friday, this all implies Michael Gove actually would have had a decent lead over Jeremy Hunt. Now, obviously it's been a bad time for Gove, but Hunt should be able to capitalise on that. And I think it is a bit of a problem. If you're trying to be a unified kind of not Boris candidate, even if you don't want to be as negative as a stop Boris candidate, then there needs to be an answer as to exactly how you're going to unify people who want very different things. Some of them are out to do that because they don't want Boris Johnson, the man, to be Prime Minister. Some of them are out stopping because they don't want particular of his ideas, particularly on Brexit, to go ahead. They don't agree with it. actually you need to prove that you're the ideal receptacle for both of those things. And currently there's nobody who's managed to demonstrate evidently convincingly that that's them.
Yes, but that's good news for Hunt as well as bad news for Hunt. The bad news is exactly what you've described. The good news is nobody else looks any better placed to take on Boris Johnson either. There's all this conversation this morning about can all these candidates, these other candidates, somehow mass together and stop Boris Johnson in a united front. And I may be proved wrong. I was proved wrong last week. I have to fess up. I thought Esther McVey would do a bit better than she did. But I'm going to put my neck on the line again and say all this idea of a unified opposition to Boris Johnson is nonsense. First of all, you can't herd MPs in this way. It was not as though Matt Hancock can march into someone else and say, I can deliver you my 19 or so votes, right? He can't, because they'll all go in their individual different ways. That's point one. Point two is people are starting to get a bit frightened of Boris Johnson. Yeah, they think he's going to win. So individual MPs will start sort of slipping off to his corner. Then finally, and this is quite a big decision for some of the others, if you're, the most topical example really is Sajid Javid. If you're Sajid Javid, how hard do you want to push back against Boris Johnson? You might well want to go to the final and beat him, but if you think you can't, isn't it best to make your peace with him now, try to cut a deal, maybe serve as Chancellor, because it's a bit like dealing with a Middle Eastern dictator. If you can't take them out in the coup, they'll march you off to the torture cells under the supervision of Spider-Man Gavin Williamson, and you'll never be seen again.
Allegedly. And so this is part of the calculation that's going to take place over the coming weekend. And I think for the smaller candidates, it's really interesting as well, because you have to work out what kind of favour is it most valuable to be owed by whom. So does Boris Johnson, in the position he's currently in, need, or more importantly, feel the need to dispense patronage in return for support? If he does, how much does he feel it's worth dishing out? And to a certain extent, I think this race for second place could be the place where ambitious people might find the best fruits. For example, if you're owed a little favour, kind of a nod of thanks by the eventual Prime Minister, theoretically, that's nice. But being owed a really big favour by somebody who ends up really senior, but a big beast as a result of having come second, because you're the person that helped them break this deadlock for second place, that could be much more valuable in the longer run. So it's a mix of different calculations for the individual candidates. But as you say, they don't own their MPs, and there's a tendency to play this like a game of Risk, where you push all the counters from one territory to another. But the simple fact is Matt Hancock can't force his troops to go Irkutsk to Kamchatka if they don't want to, because they don't belong to him.
Just on the subject of Hunt, because Andrew Jimson and I've interviewed him on the site this morning, there's a kind of sense from Hunt that he is prepared to take it all the way. Now, it's very hard to know whether that will last or not, but I was just very struck in this interview how Hunt, who normally is the most punctilious and courteous of people, while not losing those qualities, is deliberately laying into Boris Johnson now. He knows that he's got to fight to keep himself in and to gain acceleration. So there's this glorious moment in the interview where, in what I'm sure is a carefully prepared line, we asked fairly posh Jeremy Hunt whether there's too much class war in the Conservative Party at the moment, and he says, I'm not going to make an issue out of the fact that Boris Johnson went to a posher school than I did. And
I think in a sense it's a little bit presumptuous to decide that Boris Johnson is definitely the target at this stage, because is the current front runner the real challenge to somebody who's fighting for second place? Maybe they think it's important, Hunt and the others, to demonstrate that they can land a glove on the person who they think they'll be up against in the final round. But really, it ought to be the time when they're turning their fire on each other a bit. I think it's quite interesting the level of negativity that is coming out. For Jeremy Hunt, as you say, a very polite and courteous man, that's kind of almost shockingly aggressive thing to say. Some of the other candidates have said much more aggressive things than that.
I think his means of dealing with the other candidate is to try to show that he's the best person to take on Boris Johnson. Let's look ahead to next week. I mean, we've looked back on last week and agreed, rather uncontentiously, that Rory Stewart's had not at all a bad week and Boris Johnson's had a very, very good one. I mean, this week, what's it look like to you going forward?
Well, this week is going to be driven entirely by the timetable, I think. This is the week where it really starts to bite the actual kind of frenetic process of this, the series of hustings and debates and ballots, which are going to mean that we end the week, ideally, with knowing who the final two are. So we're going to have the Channel 4 debate on Sunday, with or without all of the candidates. We're going to have the second hustings on Monday. On Tuesday, we get the second actual ballot, and by 6 p.m. we'll know the result. And then that night, there'll be a BBC debate, which Boris Johnson has now said he does think it would be good to take part in, much to the annoyance of Channel 4 for obvious reasons. But it doesn't stop. On Wednesday, there's a third ballot. On and on it goes until we have that list. On Thursday, it's currently scheduled for there to be 2 more ballots. And so this is going to get to the point at which everything we've seen so far, the kind of infighting between different candidates, the consideration about when to drop out, whether to drop out, the decision for MPs when their preferred candidate has dropped out about whether to reallocate themselves, it gets faster and faster and faster, and the pressure gets applied until the field's completely clear.
So listeners, what you've got to look forward to is this Channel 4 debate on Sunday night, apparently without Boris Johnson. Then there are the events that you describe, including the second ballot on Tuesday. And then in the evening, there's a BBC debate, presumably without any of the candidates who've dropped out, any of them who failed to get the 33 votes necessary to reach the third ballot. So we could really be down to 2 or 3 people, kind of as low as that, maybe more. I mean, if I'm thinking now about who can get up to 33 votes, well, who knows? But it would seem likely that the people that you'd see going up against each other on that evening would be Boris Johnson, Jeremy Hunt, perhaps Dominic Raab and Sajid Javid. But Rory Stewart's got to do quite a bit of work to get to 33 votes, isn't he?
Which might in part explain Boris Johnson's willingness to take part in that debate on Tuesday, but not the one on Sunday. Because to a certain extent, you have this question, do you want to be in the room up against somebody who's not necessarily out to fight you for the leadership, but actually fight you for what they view as a higher stake, something worth really sacrificing lots more than than they would just for the leadership, but actually something they really believe, which means desperately trying to stop your vision of Brexit happening. And it's understandable that he might make that decision. At the same time, that illuminates the decision for MPs, those who were supporting Matt Hancock, who might no doubt be approached by Team Rory Stewart to ask for their support. They have to decide, actually, am I in this in order to influence the eventual outcome of the race by backing, say, Boris Johnson or one of the other potential leaders, or am I in it to help to get Rory Stewart into that debate, effectively to try and torpedo the Boris Johnson kind of juggernaut, to mix my metaphors. So that in itself is a really interesting part of this dynamic.
Yes, because if Rory Stewart is your kind of anti-Johnson, like sort of matter and antimatter, if he's the other charismatic person in the debate, if you're Hunt and Gove, if you're sensible, drop the attacks on Boris and let the two fight it out, with Rory Stewart attacking Johnson and yourself trying to raise yourself a bit above the fray. Johnson's been careful to ensure that almost certainly won't happen unless Stewart can somehow get enough votes to get into the third ballot. I mean, I'm trying to work out whether or not this is really going to go all the way, or whether after the second ballot, it kind of becomes clear that only one candidate other than Boris Johnson is going to make it, and the whole process is cut short.
Yeah, in that sense, the MPs who were supporting more minor candidates have quite a big influence in this part of the process. So it's not impossible if you were, say, a supporter of Andrea Leadsom or Esther McVey for ideological reasons of very deep-seated belief about the type of Brexit and type of Brexiteer that you want, or for that matter, you are a relatively hardline Brexiteer who voted for Boris Johnson in the first round and is now assured that he has enough votes. It's not impossible you might be tempted to vote for Dominic Raab, for example, to bump him back into contention, to kind of get him out of the Raab and the Sage league and bump him up into the Gove, to try and bump him up into the Gove Hunt level. Because it might feel more than a little bit appealing to try and get a final round in which you have Boris Johnson versus Dominic Raab, and whoever wins, you get a commitment to the policy that you want.
Cameron Johnson absolutely won't want that to happen, and they will scour around among these 30 votes. That's Leadsom's votes, plus McVeigh's, plus Harper's, to try and scrabble as much out of it as they can. And their chances of doing so really are quite reasonable, because on the whole, people who voted for those three candidates will be on the centre-right of the party, particularly the ones who voted for McVeigh and Leadsom. This takes us back to Rory Stewart. Rory Stewart's got very little to squeeze here. It's much more likely that Raab, Javid, Boris Johnson get a lot more out of those particular 30 votes.
Yeah, and this is a traditional and historic strategic challenge for the kind of Leaver, Brexity, Eurosceptic side of the Conservative Party, but also particularly the Parliamentary Conservative Party, which is that it can be at times astoundingly wrong-headed when it comes to strategic decisions, or astoundingly ill-disciplined. But it can also be quite effective when it has somebody with a relatively undisputed authority to knock people's heads together, whether it's Dominic Cummings in the referendum or Linton Crosby on a couple of different occasions. The question is, once you've established that authority, once it's up and running, it can only propel itself for so long. The Johnson camp are going to have to really prove in this second ballot that they can keep it going for the medium to long term.
Where's all this going, finally? I mean, I think the time will come in due course to talk about the membership stage, which isn't next week, so we'll leave it. But one's left with the inevitable question right at the very end, which is it now possible, after he's maxed out his support on the first ballot, is it possible to stop Boris Johnson? Is this whole election basically now over, and it's a kind of Roman triumphal procession all the way to Johnson putting on the laurels of the leadership?
It's so dangerous. The danger of complacency setting in, either at the top or the bottom of that campaign. Even if it doesn't actually set in, the implication or the assumption among Conservative Party members, or worse, the wider electorate, the assumption that it is there, even if it isn't, would be hugely corrosive. And nobody knows better than Boris Johnson that it's possible for everything just to kind of blow up and fall apart at a moment's notice. That's precisely why he isn't already Prime Minister, because it happened last time. So the idea, it's not nailed on. Obviously, he's got every advantage in this race at the moment, but it's not nailed on. That's why there's got to be a full contest, because you can't go into Downing Street thinking, well, maybe a potential kind of clown car explosion is going to happen now, rather than actually properly have this race to demonstrate that there is buy-in from MPs and members and get the chance to actually talk to voters about what you want to do.
Well, look, it all seems to me suddenly to be happening very fast. We're on the third of these podcasts. The race really does seem to be sort of speeding up, and we'll be back next week to see where we are. But I think in conclusion, we are reaching the final, as you say, accelerating speed of this contest, the last week of the sort of parliamentary stage. And if my voice and yours holds out, we look forward to joining the listeners again next week, when we will know who has won the parliamentary stage of this contest.